Yes, so I'm Daniel. I'm a producer at GameDuell, and we are indeed going to talk to you about how we design multiplayer games for casual market.
Hello? Hello? Can you hear me? Yes. Hello. Um, I'm Pablo Tesch. I'm producer at GameDuell, and you may know GameDuell for our skill gaming platform. But we are also doing free-to-play games. Currently, we have Grand Gin Rummy in soft launch, and it will release in the next couple of weeks. But we are also doing another multiplayer arcade game. When we talk today about competitive, what we mean with this is games that are played synchronously with or against other players. Why do we believe that the competitive aspect is so important? We think that the strongest emotions in gaming come from directly interacting with other players. If, for example, in Hearthstone you reach a legendary rank, it's way more exciting than beating a very hard level in Candy Crush. If you're not so familiar with those games, you can think of qualifying for the Champions League in soccer. And the same is true for casual competitive games. Winning a mini tournament in 8-ball pool is more exciting than a large upgrade in Heyday. And the goal of casual competitive is to bring exactly these emotions to as many players as possible. Looking at different multiplayer games, we have, for example, on the right side here, Vainglory and Hearthstone, where you need to play and train for a couple of weeks to being able to start playing competitively. In the middle, you have Supercell's Clash Royale, which, if you're an intense player, after a few days, you can actually start playing on the lower arenas. But we have decided to focus on the casual side, where the entry barriers are very low and you can compete at the very first day. It's here in this example, it's Grand Gin Rummy and 8-ball pool. We see further opportunities in focusing on the casual side, though. We think that there are more gameplay innovations to discover and that there are fewer competitors right now. So today, we want to share with you our 5 tips for casual competitive games. We will use Grand Gin Rummy as our primary example, as it shows how we solved some of the challenges. Grand Gin Rummy is based on the popular card game Gin, and it offers different fast-paced multiplayer game modes, and is set in a 1920s hotel setting. First tip is how to solve liquidity. Liquidity is always needed so that players can find opponents without too high waiting times. To understand liquidity, it's helpful to get to calculate your liquidity success threshold. This is a formula that we use, and it gives us a daily active user number, which is our minimum users that we need, so we don't expect players from churning because of those too long waiting times. And it can help to identify how many daily active users you need, but it can also, in designing your game, helping to improve of lowering this threshold. For example, the fragmentation factor, you could choose to combine or cut a game mode, and this then basically with one less lobby in your game, one less fragmentation factor for your matchmaking, it would lower the minimum daily active users you need. Another example is the worst hour factor, which describes how players are distributed throughout your day, basically comparing the worst hour to your good hours. And a measure to avoid this is you release in different time zone clusters, so the liquidity is spread out evenly throughout the day. If we apply this formula for Grand Gin Rummy, it gives us following results. We will need 144,000 players per day to have a very good liquidity. And this can be tough, especially in early soft launch. One measure that we took is we developed with an internal framework, the Duel tool, but it's basically just a cross-platform framework. So we release a game on different platforms for Grand Gin Rummy. It is Android, iOS, and Facebook. And all of those contribute to a shared pool of users. And yeah, this helps a lot in user acquisition and getting to those DAU numbers. The second tip binds in with another measure for liquidity. It's bound session length. What we mean with this is that sessions are designed in a way so that players can predict the time commitment that they need to invest. And it's particularly important in multiplayer games, as leaving a game is hurting the other player's game experience a lot. And except a few trolls, no one really likes this, so yeah. One bad example is the otherwise great game Hearthstone, where the commitment is very, very uncertain, and it highly depends on what types of decks are chosen or how much time players need to think to make their move. And it has real impact on how the game is played. So here it leads to lesser diversity. As fast decks are very efficient in ranking, they are often preferred over decks that maybe have a better win rate or are more fun to play. Time limits are a mechanic that can help. So especially in synchronous games, it can help a lot as players understand their time commitment very precisely. But they can also help to reduce stress because of the same reason. Players understand when the pressure of the competition is going to end and how long they need to focus. For Grand Gin Rummy, we had two main measures that helped us improving the session design. The first one was we really looked deeply in how all our animations and timings were working. So this is a very great measure because it doesn't really affect any rule of the game or the quality of the experience, but we added or optimized a few milliseconds here and there in victory screens, etc., and it adds up to minutes of gameplay that in the end bring you more games. And the second thing is, not sure if you know the card game Gin, but it's played until you play a series of games and until one player reaches 100 points. And what we did is we give a point bonus for winning a round. And this decreases the number of rounds, and it effectively decreased the duration of a session by 30%, so very significantly. Of course, with rules changes like this, and especially in a classic card game, you need to be very careful, but we spoken to a lot of users, and luckily they don't mind this change, and it's not hurting the experience in our specific case. So both of these measures really speeded up the session duration without hurting the experience. And yeah, jumping back to this, more games, shorter sessions, more games, and again, fewer liquidity that you need. And that's where I hand over to Daniel.
Thank you very much. So the third point for us is that you need to sort of like at an early stage start thinking about how you're going to overcome ping issues or latency issues. Of course, you need a technical backend that can handle all this type of synchronous interaction, but I think there's also some good ways to think it into the design. So for Grand Gin Rummy, obviously Gin Rummy is a turn-based card game, so we didn't really have a lot of choice there. However, what we did do was to make it synchronous, so both players are actually active at the same time. The other example I have up here is Outwitters, which is an asynchronous turn-based game, meaning that I take my turn, I send it over to you, then maybe half a day later, maybe 5 minutes later, you send it back to me, and we sort of ping back and forth. The problem we found in the asynchronous version is that it leads to very, very long game sessions, or to actually finish a game you have to play sometimes for several days, and unfortunately it also leads to high incompletion rates because one of the players might just stop playing altogether and then the game effectively ends. So by having both players present at the table at the same time, we really have this sense of the other person is there, you are playing someone, you can see their play style, you can see how long they deliberate, taking their move. So there's more of a sense of presence, and obviously there's also a higher completion rate. But if you look to other companies right now, again, I think Supercell's Clash Royale, which is still in soft launch, but I think it's a great example of where we're heading, in my opinion. And this is, if you haven't played it, a real-time strategy game in a way. It's basically somewhat tower defensey. You have to knock the opponent's towers, and most games last between 3 and 5 minutes. And the great thing they do is they have these delays on real-time interaction, meaning that when you want to do something, there's a minimum 1 second delay on something actually happening, and that gives the game time to sync between the two clients, which is really important when people are playing on cellular networks. They also have another feature that I really admire, which is that all the units operate with AI patterns. So you don't have to micromanage, you don't have to give individual orders. And a part of the game is also to start playing around with these AI patterns as the players. So I think that's a really interesting example. So our fourth point is if you're making a multiplayer game, you're also making a social game. By definition, multiplayer has to be social. You, as a game developer, you decide how you're going to make this social. And I think it's interesting when you say social game, a lot of people are thinking of, for example, something like Simpsons Tapped Out. And I think it has some interesting. There's like an interesting misunderstanding in it, because a lot of the current synchronous multiplayer games, they basically ask you to choose between playing with strangers, where you'll get rewards, you'll rank, you'll get gold, whatever, or play with friends, and they don't give you any rewards. And this is, of course, because they want to avoid you from basically playing yourself and cheating the system. But it's also a pity, because if you're strapped on time, you are basically de-incentivized from playing with your friends, which a game like this is really good at actually incentivizing you to do, and this is great for long-term retention. And one of the examples, this is my favorite example of how a multiplayer game becomes very social. This is the download chart for Flappy Golf around 1.5 years ago. If you haven't played Flappy Golf, play Flappy Golf. And the interesting thing, I think you might be able to see it, but it dips every so often, and when it dips, it's on the weekends. And the developer Noodle Cake, they didn't do any paid marketing on this, and their explanation was, well, this is probably the schoolyard effect or the workplace effect, meaning that in breaks, people are playing this game against each other, and other people can very quickly download the game and jump right into the action. There's not a long tutorial. You can get to play, and there's not a long learning curve either. So I think this is a great example of how the social element in a game is very important for both spread, but also for capturing your player base. And in one of our older examples, this is a French card game called Belote. We did not do we never built a feature for friends to actually challenge each other, but if you're a little bit smart, there's a pretty easy way to basically game the matchmaking algorithm. So if 2 players pressed play at the very, very close to each other, they would get matched with each other. It was just the way that the matchmaking was working. So that was all fine, and it worked quite well. People could do it if they wanted to. However, then we built a tournament feature. And with this tournament feature, suddenly people could play each other in a tournament or play themselves in a tournament and then get a really, really unfair advantage. And suddenly we had to choose between saving the tournament and saving our friend matchmaking. And unfortunately, we had to save the tournament. And I think if we would redo this project, we would definitely think in this friend aspect a lot stronger in early stages, just how the whole infrastructure is done on the game. Then the final point, I guess monetization is always hard. For casual multiplayer, I would probably say monetization is harder. And this is because there are some conflicts in how typical casual games monetize compared to free-to-play, and also the whole multiplayer aspect. And I'll dive a little bit into that now. So typically in a free-to-play game, the elder gameplay is really where a lot of the monetization happens. It's where players really spend a lot of time, and they eventually also spend a lot of money. And a good example to illustrate it is from Dungeon Boss, where you have this typical sort of, oh, he started level 1 and now he's level 61. Look how fucking awesome he is, and he has. Sorry, I don't know if I'm supposed to swear. and 5 stars and everything, and it's amazing. The problem with this type of elder game, though, is that it really requires a player to have a basic understanding of combat mechanics, understanding, well, what does attack mean, what's ability, what are the synergies between different abilities in your team. It requires a basic gaming understanding that I think probably a lot of us have, but very casual players might not have this. So I think a good example for a game that does this is 8-Ball Pool. So they basically take exactly the same thing. So you have pool cues that have different stats. One pool cue might hit really hard, but then it has low accuracy. And obviously there are some that are just cumulatively better. So for me, it's quite important to take this elder game and wrap it in something that a casual player can sort of instinctively understand. A lot of people have had a pool cue in their hand. They know that they are different. So it's something to think about, and also just to be aware of that a lot of our assumptions about game understanding might not be true for very casual players. Secondly, there is really a conflict between synchronous multiplayer games and boosters. By boosters, I mean on the left you can see Candy Crush Saga, which is, I think, the most successful example of selling boosters. So you know when you're in a hot state and you're almost beating the level, but you ran out of moves, and if you can just buy a couple of extra moves, everything will be fine, and you might beat the level. This is awesome. It works really well in the single-player game. But if you do the same thing in a multiplayer game, and it's the point of conflict where it might tip either way, and then you sell the one side a booster, the other person is going to feel really pissed off because it feels like cheating, right? I mean, it's a booster. It's an unfair advantage that you're buying in the moment. So this is really something where I know some games basically sell boosters, but they do it very hiddenly. So it's like, okay, you can buy it, but we're not going to tell the other person about it. So, you know, good on you. But one game, this is actually another game from King. It's also a card game, and they allow you to mulligan your hand in the first when you start the game for a very small amount of soft currency. It's not hidden to the opponent, and it's something we considered doing for our card game as well. We didn't do it in the end because we're fearing player sort of backlash on this, which I don't know what design is better. I guess we'll see. It might just show that maybe King has bigger balls than we do. All right, so finally, the third point is player activity. So most of you are probably familiar with the idea of having an energy mechanic. So this idea of every time you play, you spend some energy, and at some point you run out of energy, and either you pay some money to refill your energy, or you wait a couple of hours. But it's a hard stop to your session if you don't pay. And a lot of synchronous multiplayer games, as Pablo was talking about, really rely on having this liquidity. So you need players to be in the lobby because otherwise other players aren't going to be able to find someone to play with. And Hearthstone did this in a really elegant way, and I see a lot of games following this this design, is instead of putting this hard stop at saying, okay, now your session is over, they basically de-incentivize playing more. So you can play if you want to. If you're interested in just ranking, you can do it. But at the beginning of the day, you have your daily quests. Once they're done, you can still gain gold, but it's at a very slow pace compared to what it is in the beginning of the session. And I think this is again really the way forward on this. So to wrap it all up and to leave some time for questions, think about liquidity and improve liquidity by having sort of a nice nice short session. Make the game less reliant on ping, just based on the design as well. Of course, tech is also nice, and let players be social, and even more attention to monetization. So, now, if you have any questions, we'll be happy to answer.
Thanks a lot, and please, questions.
What is the ideal duration of a session for a multiplayer game, please?
Yeah, I can answer this. So it's the same. Basically, it's depending on the platform. So as long as you're doing mobile, it's still the 1 to 3 minutes. That's 1 or 2 bus stops, I would say. So if you can fit it in, it's great, but not for every game it's working like this. So I mean, Hearthstone is a great success, and they have session lengths between 5 and 20 minutes, which is wild.
So at the end, you were spoken about this contradiction between fair play and monetization. So the mulligan was a kind of a, well, actually not cheating, because your opponent sees that you just changed some cards in your hand, and the result is unpredictable even for the one who's doing this, right?
Yes.
So is there, are there any other well, ways to monetize this fair play? Maybe some options in the beginning, or maybe, for example, to double your reward if you win for a soft cash and stuff like that?
I can't really think of any good examples in a competitive game. I think in a cooperative game, my favorite example is Man vs. Machine for Team Fortress. This is a game mode where you play with a team against AI. If you buy these premium tickets, you're guaranteed a certain level of loot, but so is everyone on your team. And this stacks, so if everybody on the team buys this ticket, everyone gets a ton of loot. So there it's sort of you improve a reward for yourself, but it spreads across the team, which I think is a very nice design as well.
Hi. Did you guys consider using different visual elements for players to monetize from? Or just like weapon skins in Counter-Strike Global Offensive or Team Fortress 2?
Yeah, it is something we're considering, and we are working on things like this. Sort of, again, what you're probably what you're hinting at is probably the element of sort of vanity in multiplayer games, which I think is really strong, especially in Synchronous, because you know other people see you, and then you want to look cool. Yeah, that's definitely something we're looking into as well.
When dealing with network issues, is it instantly that the game ends, or did you find any solution to that problem?
We probably cannot answer it technically correct, but there is definitely possibilities for reconnecting and having some delays, latency, buffers, etc. So there's a lot of architecture needed to solve it correct, but yeah, it can be handled.
Yeah, we often, I mean, for the card games, it's a little bit easier because it's quite clear on the states. So we often plug in an AI. If you lose connection, we put in an AI, and you have something. You have a limited window to basically reconnect to the game. We have this working, and then you just go back in and you take over whatever the AI did while you were away.
All right, thanks.
So, any more questions? No. Okay, guys, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.